think you understand the people in your life. You trust your instincts to spot manipulation, recognize toxic behavior, identify when someone crosses boundaries. But here's what might shock you. The most dangerous individuals aren't the obvious villains. They're charming, they're helpful. Sometimes they're even family. While you're busy protecting yourself from clear threats, you're leaving yourself wide open to something far more sinister. The hidden invasion of other people's unconscious minds into yours. Carl Jung spent decades unraveling these invisible dynamics. His groundbreaking work on the ego and unconscious reveals a disturbing truth. Most of what controls our behavior happens below the surface of awareness. This doesn't just apply to you. It applies to everyone around you, and that's exactly where the real danger begins. When someone remains blind to their own psychological darkness, that shadow needs somewhere to go. More often than not, it finds its way to you. Stop and consider this for a moment. How often do you walk away from conversations feeling completely drained? How many times have you been blamed for situations you had nothing to do with? When did someone last treat you like their personal savior for problems that weren't yours to solve? Jung identified this as projection. It's an unconscious process where people throw onto you everything they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. From that instant forward, you stop being seen as an individual. Instead, you become a symbol, a reflection, an imaginary enemy, an idealized rescuer. None of these projections represent who you actually are. The truly frightening part? You often don't even realize you've become trapped in this psychological game. You believe you're helping. You think you're showing compassion. You assume you're being mature and understanding. Meanwhile, you're drowning in someone else's psychological battlefield. You're attempting to solve conflicts that belong to them. You're being controlled by dynamics you never created, but now dominate your entire existence. This isn't limited to people with malicious intentions. Jung made this crystal clear. The greatest psychological threats don't come from conscious predators. They come from unconsciously fragmented individuals. People living disconnected from their own psyche, controlled by masks, unhealed trauma, internal complexes, and buried desires. They're not evil in the traditional sense. They're dangerous in ways that are much harder to detect. This danger operates silently. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in gradually through seemingly innocent comments, subtle accusations, meaningful silences. Day by day, interaction by interaction, until you begin questioning your own reality. When you lose touch with your authentic psychological self, you become absorbed into their shadow. Maybe this is happening to you right now. In a romantic relationship, a friendship, your workplace, even within your own family structure. Perhaps you're blaming yourself, wondering what's wrong with your responses, your reactions, your very being. The answer is simple. Nothing is wrong with you, but something is deeply wrong with how you're being used as a container for someone else's unconscious material. Today we're going to expose the 6 psychological types that Jung would classify as emotionally hazardous. These aren't people acting from deliberate cruelty. They're driven by internal forces they themselves don't understand or recognize, and that's precisely what makes them so destructive. We'll use Jung's own concepts and warnings, drawn directly from works like The Ego and the Unconscious, and Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. You'll learn to recognize these patterns. But more importantly, we'll help you discover whether one or more of these patterns might be operating within your own psyche as well. Ready to begin this journey? Take a deep breath and prepare yourself. After today, you'll never look at human relationships the same way again. Picture living with someone who holds you responsible for every emotion they experience. Someone who transforms your very presence into an emotional trigger. Someone who makes you feel accountable for feelings you never caused or even influenced. At first, they appear sensitive, thoughtful, emotionally deep and complex. But gradually, you realize you're being pulled into a war zone that has nothing to do with you. A battle where you're already losing before you even understand the rules. This is the unconscious projector, an individual unaware of their own psychological wounds who uses others as targets for their internal survival mechanisms. Jung observed, what we refuse to confront within ourselves, we will meet as our destiny. Often, this destiny has a name, a face, and sits across from you at dinner. The unconscious projector lives dominated by repressed psychological material, unintegrated traumas, unprocessed emotional fragments. Rather than turning inward for healing, they aim outward and transform you into a canvas for their internal battles. This person exists in a state of chronic projection. Jung understood projection as a natural psychological function, but when it remains unrecognized, it becomes destructive. In The Ego and the Unconscious, he explains how projection creates psychological blindness, a prison where others stop being seen as they truly are and instead become symbols of what we hide within ourselves. This is exactly how the unconscious projector operates. They don't see you as you actually are. They see a lost fragment of themselves and react to that imaginary version as if it were reality. These individuals consistently position themselves as victims. Everything that happens becomes someone else's fault, never their own. When they feel anger, you provoked it. When they experience sadness, you disappointed them. When they feel inadequate, it's because you act superior. This distortion operates so subtly that you start questioning your own perceptions. Did I really say something insensitive? Was I actually being thoughtless? Am I the toxic one in this situation? This is how manipulation occurs without raised voices or direct demands. It's entirely emotional, completely unconscious, and devastatingly effective. What makes this even more dangerous is that these people often possess natural charm. They radiate charisma, sensitivity, emotional intensity. This creates a psychological trap because you believe you can help them, heal them, understand them better than anyone else has. But what you're actually doing is sacrificing your psychological well-being trying to rescue someone who refuses to look inward at themselves. The harder you try, the deeper you sink. Jung warns that these projection patterns are especially dangerous because they place us in symbolic roles. Savior, enemy, betrayer, parent figure. Anything except who we genuinely are. Living within a symbolic relationship means living within an illusion. You stop being treated as a complete person and instead become a distorted reflection of someone else's unconscious material. The only protection against an unconscious projector is developing awareness, learning to recognize these patterns, cutting the invisible emotional threads connecting you to their internal narrative. Most importantly, constantly questioning whether what you're feeling actually belongs to you or has been unconsciously induced. The unconscious projector doesn't invade your life through obvious force. They enter through the opening of your natural empathy. Once you recognize this pattern, the next step involves understanding how it disguises itself even more deeply behind social masks. The persona bearer doesn't just project their conflicts onto you. They can pull you into a world where even you forget who you really are. If this content is helping you understand these dynamics, make sure to subscribe to Sacred Patterns. Your support means everything to us. Not every psychological danger announces itself through extreme behaviors. Sometimes it emerges from what appears too perfect. The perpetually ready smile, the flawless posture, the impeccable public image. We live in an age obsessed with appearances where being authentic matters less than seeming perfect. Jung recognized this as a serious psychological problem. When someone over-identifies with their persona, the social mask we use to adapt to different environments, they risk completely disconnecting from their authentic essence. Those who live entirely for the mask don't just lose themselves. They begin distorting everyone in their vicinity as well. In the ego and the unconscious, Jung states that the persona represents what someone is not, but what both they and others believe they are. In other words, it's an artificial construction shaped by social, family, and professional expectations. The persona itself isn't inherently problematic. We all use social masks. They allow us to fulfill necessary roles: doctor, teacher, parent, friend. The problem begins when someone believes they are only that mask. When the facade becomes permanently attached to their identity and everything spontaneous, vulnerable, and authentic gets locked away in the basement of their psyche. Asterisk. The persona bearer masters functional superficiality. They say what others want to hear. They behave appropriately in every situation. They avoid conflict at all costs. But behind this controlled exterior lies a soul in complete ruins. The more energy they invest in maintaining their image, the more they suffocate their authentic self. This repression always demands payment eventually. Asterisk. For those living with this type of person, the impact runs deep. Something feels wrong, but you can't identify what exactly. There's an absence of spontaneity, truth, and genuine depth in your interactions. Everything feels rehearsed and artificial. Worse yet, the persona bearer projects their perfectionism demands onto you as well. They expect you to perform, to fit into their scripted reality, to collaborate in their psychological theater. If you express something outside their acceptable script, an intense emotion, a doubt, authentic pain, they withdraw, become uncomfortable, shut down completely. Everything that reminds them of their own repressed material becomes unbearable to witness. Jung warned that this type of persona identification represents one of the greatest threats to individuation, the journey toward self-knowledge and psychological integration. The real danger emerges when someone becomes hypnotized by the role they perform, genuinely believing they are what others perceive them to be. When someone lives exclusively to be accepted, recognized, and praised, they become a prisoner of their own facade. Everything authentic dies, suffocated beneath the veneer. Living with someone like this can cause you to doubt your own spontaneity. You begin policing yourself, measuring every word, hiding parts of yourself that don't match their idealized narrative. Gradually, you start wearing a mask too, without even noticing it happening. Coexisting with a persona bearer isn't just inauthentic, It's psychologically contagious, but there's something even darker lurking beneath this surface. When someone represses what they truly feel, think, and desire for extended periods, those emotions don't simply disappear. They accumulate. They ferment in the unconscious until they transform into shadow material. Then we enter an even more dangerous psychological territory, the realm of denied emotions that eventually return with explosive force. Next, we'll explore the repressed shadow bearer, someone who refuses to acknowledge their own darkness until it erupts beyond their control. There's a type of person who lives in complete control, polished, restrained, always appropriate, always measured, always courteous. But beneath this veneer of psychological balance lies a force ready to break free at any moment. Everything they consider wrong, ugly, or unacceptable gets pushed down into the basement of their psyche. It's not transformed or integrated. It's simply repressed and denied. This is the essence of the repressed shadow bearer, someone who tries to remain in the light constantly until their darkness seizes complete control. Carl Jung devoted significant portions of his work to understanding the shadow. In In, he states, "The shadow represents everything an individual refuses to acknowledge about themselves, yet insists on expressing somehow. We're not discussing something external here. The shadow isn't the evil in the world. It's not other people. It's not external enemies. The shadow is internal. It's the hatred you won't admit to feeling, the envy you rationalize away, the sexuality you suppress, the ambition you disguise as humility. Everything you reject within yourself doesn't vanish. It transforms into shadow material. As Jung taught, what you don't make conscious ends up directing your life, and you call it fate. The repressed shadow bearer doesn't appear dangerous initially. On the contrary, they're often admired, disciplined, kind, helpful individuals, but something feels off. They can't tolerate weakness in others. They react poorly to spontaneous expressions. They're disturbed by intense emotions. They always seem internally charged, but never openly explode until they do. When that happens, the results are devastating. This person lives in constant emotional surveillance mode. They don't allow themselves to feel authentic emotions and therefore condemn those who do. They don't permit themselves to make mistakes, so they attack those who do. They become moralistic, demanding, controlling. All of this represents an attempt to keep their unconscious material under rigid control. Jung was clear about this dynamic. The stronger the persona, the more repressed the shadow becomes. And the more repressed the shadow, the more brutal its eventual manifestation will be. You can identify this pattern in people who have completely disproportionate reactions, who explode over minor incidents, who hold grudges for years, who sabotage relationships through passive-aggressive behaviors. These are the famously difficult people whom nobody understands why they're so bitter, resentful, and critical. The answer lies in their unintegrated, unrecognized, unaccepted shadow material. Here's the most important point. The shadow isn't composed only of negative qualities. Jung made it clear that it also contains your denied potential, your repressed creativity, your hidden strengths. But when the shadow remains ignored, all of this psychological gold transforms into poison. This poison contaminates relationships, environments, and especially those who are closest to the shadow bearer. Living with someone who owns a repressed shadow feels like existing next to an emotional minefield. You never know where you're stepping until you trigger an explosion, but this repression doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's often fed by illusions of moral superiority, by rigid ideological systems that transform guilt into a tool of psychological control. This leads us to our next type, the moral controller. Someone who not only represses their own desires, but makes you feel guilty for experiencing yours. Next, we'll unmask this figure that Jung viewed as one of the greatest obstacles to psychological freedom, the self-appointed guardian of virtue, who secretly harbors their own demons. Not every psychological executioner carries a visible weapon. Some use religious symbols, rigid rules, dogmatic beliefs, and rehearsed moral phrases. These are people who claim to be motivated by ethics, righteousness, and moral superiority. But deep down, they're imprisoning both themselves and others within a cage constructed from guilt and shame. Jung was intimately familiar with this archetype. For him, when morality becomes a facade, it transforms into one of the most insidious forms of psychological repression. This describes the moral controller perfectly. Someone who, instead of integrating their own shadow, projects it onto other people's behavior and condemns them for what they refuse to accept within themselves. You've certainly encountered someone like this. People who constantly point fingers but never engage in self-reflection, who position themselves as behavioral authorities not because they genuinely are, but because they desperately need to maintain an image of moral superiority. According to Jung, the greater the internal repression, the more intense the need to project shadow material. This is exactly what the moral controller does. They transform others into sinners, deviants, immoral beings to avoid confronting their own desires, impulses, and contradictions. The problem is that unlike typical emotional manipulators, the moral controller genuinely believes they're doing good. They sincerely think they're correcting, saving, or educating others. This makes their influence even more toxic because it comes wrapped in authority, good intentions, and false spirituality. Their criticism arrives accompanied by phrases like, "This is for your own benefit," "You'll thank me later," or "Someone needs to tell you the truth." But this truth isn't neutral or objective. It's saturated with psychological projection. In Jung extensively discusses the Christ and Antichrist figures as archetypes of psychological wholeness and dissociation. The moral controller believes they embody pure light while completely ignoring their own darkness. They project evil onto others to maintain the illusion of internal purity. This makes them blind, dangerous, incapable of seeing the nuances and complexities of human psychology. If you live close to someone like this, you might start feeling constantly guilty, as if you're always making mistakes. Even when you're simply living authentically, you feel watched, judged, diminished. The most perverse aspect is that you often internalize their judgment. You begin repressing parts of yourself that are natural, human, spontaneous. You mold yourself to fit an ideal that isn't yours. Their version of morality becomes your psychological prison. This dynamic is common in families, religious institutions, and rigid environments where obedience gets confused with virtue. Jung saw this pattern as a real threat to the individuation process. Where excessive moralism exists, self-knowledge is absent. The extreme moralist doesn't want truth, they want control. When they can't control the external world, they begin controlling the internal worlds of those around them. But the moral controller isn't the only type. Guided by unconscious forces, there's another type that's even more volatile, unstable, and unpredictable: the complex-dominated individual. While the moralist represses and projects, the complex-dominated person gets completely overtaken by unconscious psychological contents. They react from these buried materials like an emotional puppet whose strings are pulled by invisible forces. Next, we'll dive into this explosive psychological territory where consciousness loses control and past traumas take the wheel of the toes. Psyche. Prepare to encounter the type of person who can embrace you today and attempt to destroy you tomorrow, without even understanding why. If what you're hearing resonates deeply with you, you'll find tremendous value in diving deeper into these psychological concepts. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward psychological freedom. Imagine living with someone who in one moment appears sweet, affectionate, generous, and in the next moment erupts in rage, withdraws into hostile silence, or accuses you of something that never entered your mind. A compliment suddenly becomes a demand. A joke transforms into aggression. A gesture of affection gets interpreted as a threat. No matter what you do, you're always walking on psychologically unstable ground. This describes the experience of living alongside someone dominated by unconscious complexes. For Jung, complexes are autonomous clusters of emotion and memory residing in the unconscious that can hijack consciousness at any moment. They function like fragmented personalities within us, created by traumas, psychological wounds, and unresolved experiences. In psychological types and the ego and the unconscious, Jung describes how these complexes can directly interfere with individual behavior, causing people to react not to present reality but to echoes from their past. A simple comment unconsciously connects to an old abandonment, rejection, or humiliation, and everyone nearby pays the psychological price. The complex-dominated person doesn't realize they're being controlled by these internal forces. When they react with fury, extreme sadness, or exaggerated resentment, they believe they're being rational and justified, but they're not responding to current reality. They're reliving undigested emotional experiences from their past. The problem is this doesn't happen consistently. It occurs in unpredictable episodes. Emotional explosions get interspersed with moments of lucidity, genuine affection, or sincere regret. This makes the relationship with such a person even more confusing and psychologically addictive. You start thinking, they're not always like this. Sometimes they're wonderful. That's exactly what keeps you emotionally hooked. There are moments of genuine connection, real affection, authentic intimacy. But these moments get followed by unpredictable ruptures where you find yourself in the middle of an emotional hurricane you don't understand. In an attempt to restore harmony, you adapt, shrink, accommodate. You start avoiding certain topics, measuring every word, walking on eggshells to avoid awakening the monster sleeping within the other person. But here's the brutal truth. That monster isn't awakened by you. It's always there, latent, hungry, waiting for any trigger to emerge. When it does surface, it consumes everything in its vicinity. For Jung, unrecognized complexes end up colonizing the entire psyche. They speak for you, feel for you, act for you. In the case of the complex-dominated person, this psychological takeover happens frequently. They might be controlled by complexes of inferiority, martyrdom, abandonment, persecution. Each complex carries its own narratives, emotions, and demands. The more you try to maintain peace, the more you feed the illusion that it's possible to control the uncontrollable. Being close to someone like this means living in constant emotional alert. There's never psychological stability. The present moment always gets contaminated by ghosts from the past. Sooner or later, you begin absorbing these psychological ghosts. You start doubting yourself, your memory, your emotional responses. Without realizing it, you too become colonized by the other person's unconscious material. But the most dangerous type is yet to come. While the complex-dominated person oscillates between emotional extremes, there's another type who doesn't shout, doesn't explode, doesn't accuse, but systematically drains your energy until you have nothing left. In our final section, we'll discuss the psychic vampire, the individual who feeds on your time, attention, and empathy, leaving you exhausted, depleted, and empty. With them, we'll complete this cycle by revealing what Jung truly believed to be the way out of this unconscious psychological jungle. Some people don't want your presence. They want your energy. They'll do everything possible to drain it completely, not through violence or explicit aggression, but through subtle demands. Chronic victimhood, emotional dependency, camouflaged as love and affection. This is the psychic vampire, the most silent and insidious form of emotional drainage that Carl Jung ever warned about. Even if he didn't use that exact terminology. In Jungian language, this represents the unresolved symbiotic relationship, the pathological bond that prevents psychological growth and dissolves the boundaries of authentic selfhood. Jung, throughout the ego and the unconscious and IN, shows us that one of the greatest threats to individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, is symbiotic relationships where two people don't recognize themselves as separate individuals, but as psychological extensions of one another. The psychic vampire lives exclusively within this type of connection. They need your constant attention, your daily comfort, your perpetual availability. But behind their neediness lies a psychological void that doesn't belong to you, and that you will never be able to fill. You begin by offering support, then you give your time, then you tolerate emotional abuse in the name of understanding and compassion. Eventually, you realize all your energy is being systematically drained, and you no longer know where the other person ends and where you begin. The exhaustion runs deeper than physical tiredness. It's existential depletion. It feels as if your soul is being devoured drop by drop, day after day. Jung spoke of people who, unable to sustain themselves psychologically, attach to others like emotional parasites. As harsh as it sounds, this is the psychological reality. The psychic vampire doesn't want to grow or develop. They want to be carried through life by someone else's energy, but the danger extends beyond simple exhaustion. It's the dissolution of your authentic self. You start feeling guilty for wanting personal space, selfish for craving silence, cold for desiring distance. The psychic vampire masters the art of reversing roles. From victim, they become accuser. From needy, they transform into manipulator. Before you realize what's happening, you're living. To avoid crises, to maintain artificial peace, to sustain a bond that's slowly killing you from within. Jung offers us a path forward, making the unconscious conscious. This applies both to understanding others and to understanding ourselves. Because perhaps at some point in your life, you too have been a psychic vampire, or a complex dominated person, or a persona bearer. None of us is immune to these psychological patterns. We all carry shadow material. We all have unhealed wounds. The difference lies in who has the courage to look inward honestly, and who chooses to project that psychological weight onto others. This exploration has been a mirror, a deep dive into the dynamics that bind us, hurt us, and keep us unconscious. If you've stayed with us this far, it means you're ready to see clearly, to name these patterns, to break free from unconscious psychological prisons. This represents the first and most powerful form of freedom. It's not about blaming others, but about stepping out of the victim position, about reclaiming sovereignty over your own psychological territory. Now I want you to participate actively. Leave in the comments which of these profiles you've encountered in your life, and which ones you honestly recognize within yourself. Your comment could be the beginning of awareness, both yours and for others who read it. Before you go, here's an important notice. Our next exploration will take you even deeper into this journey of self-knowledge. Keep watching, because the more light we shine on unconscious patterns, the less they control our lives. See you there.